You know, there are some rules, some unwritten laws of history that are just carved in stone, or maybe written in blood and ice. And if you break them, the consequences are, well, they're catastrophic. Today, we're going to dive into the story of one of those moments when one of those laws got broken and the most powerful army on Earth ran headfirst into an enemy it just couldn't beat. For more than 100 years, this wasn't just a piece of advice. No, this was a law, seared into the memory of Europe. The lesson was learned the hard way, back in 1812, when Napoleon's legendary army marched into Russia and a frozen, skeletal ghost of an army stumbled back out. The lesson couldn't have been clearer. The Russian winner doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care who you are.
And this is the price tag for learning that lesson. Over 500,000 of Napoleon's soldiers gone. For 130 years, their frozen bodies served as a warning that in 1941, the German High Command was absolutely convinced they could ignore.
So you might be asking, how did they plan to avoid the same fate as Napoleon? Well, the plan was simple, almost arrogant in its simplicity. They'd win before the first snow fell. Operation Barbarossa was all about speed, a lightning campaign. They'd launch in June, roll into Moscow by October, and declare victory before winter even had a chance to get out of bed. They gave themselves 5 months. Wow. This quote, it just says it all, doesn't it? This perfectly captures the incredible confidence, the sheer hubris at the very core of the German plan. They were convinced the Soviet Union was so weak, so fragile, that one single massive punch would be enough to shatter it. They weren't just planning for a win, they were expecting a total collapse.
And the guy they picked to deliver that punch? General Heinz Guderian. This man was the inventor of Blitzkrieg, the master of lightning warfare. He was all about speed, shock, and just relentless momentum. If anybody on Earth could beat the clock and get to Moscow before the winter, it was him. And for a while there, man, it really looked like they were gonna do it. The start of the invasion was just devastatingly successful. They smashed right through Soviet defenses, swallowed up entire armies, and chewed up hundreds of kilometers in just a few weeks. By the fall, Guderian's lead troops could literally see the golden spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They were that close. And to really get why they were so confident, you've just got to look at the numbers. We are talking about the largest invasion force in human history. 3 million soldiers. Thousands upon thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. This wasn't some wild gamble. This was a meticulously planned operation on a scale that's almost impossible to imagine. And it was designed to do one thing: land a knockout blow. But here's the thing, that knockout blow, it never landed. The Soviet Union didn't just crumble. And as the summer bled into a muddy, miserable autumn, the German army's most precious asset, time, was starting to run out. And then winter arrived. And it wasn't just a bit of bad weather, it was a weapon. Now check this out. What's so insane about this is just how fast the temperature plummeted. This wasn't a nice, gentle slide into winter. This was like falling off a cliff straight into an Arctic deep freeze. In less than a single month, the temperature dropped by over 25 degrees Celsius, hitting levels that the German war machine was just not built for, not even close.
And this right here, this shows you exactly why that cold was so deadly. It's really a tale of two different armies. The German tanks had gasoline engines that refused to start and narrow tracks that just sank into the deep snow. The Soviet T-34s, they had diesel engines that worked fine in the cold and wide tracks that let them glide over it. One army was built for a quick summer vacation, the other was built for a Russian winter.
And the failure wasn't just on the front lines. The entire supply chain just froze solid. Trains carrying vital supplies were literally frozen to the tracks. Truck engines cracked from the cold. And unbelievably, warehouses packed with winter uniforms were sitting in depots 1,000 kilometers away, all because the planners had been so ridiculously sure the war would be over by then. So this massive strategic disaster very quickly became a deeply human one. Let's switch gears and focus on what Guderian himself, the master of fast-moving warfare, saw as his unstoppable army was being frozen solid right where it stood. This number, it's just staggering. By the beginning of December, for every one of Guderian's soldiers being wounded in combat, 3 more were becoming casualties of the cold. Frostbite, hypothermia, exposure. The weather itself had become the main enemy. And to really understand what that means, just listen to this story from when Guderian visited a field hospital. A young lieutenant tried to stand up out of respect when the general walked in, but his feet were frozen so completely solid that when he put his weight on them, they just shattered at the ankle, still inside his boots.
That was the brutal reality his men were facing every single day.
This line from Guderian's own diary, it says everything. This is that moment when a supremely confident commander realizes he's led his men into a trap he can't get them out of. He's not just seeing a battle being lost, you can feel him being crushed by the weight of a war being lost, and he knows it's happening. And it was right then, at this very moment of total vulnerability, with the German army completely paralyzed by the cold, that the Soviets struck back. This was the turning point, not just for the battle for Moscow, but for the entire war on the Eastern Front.
So where did this massive counterattack even come from? German intelligence were sure the Red Army was broken, finished, but the Soviets had an ace up their sleeve. Fresh divisions brought all the way from Siberia. These weren't just soldiers, these were men who grew up in -40-degree weather. They came with skis, white camouflage, and the ability to fight in conditions that were literally killing the Germans where they stood. Now, faced with this onslaught, any sane military commander would tell you to pull back, find a defensive line, and survive the winter. But Hitler, safe in his headquarters hundreds of miles away, he issued this infamous order: stand and fight. No retreats. It was an order that turned a crisis into an absolute catastrophe, basically sentencing thousands of men to freeze to death in holes they could no longer defend. But in the end, you can't fight reality. The front just collapsed. And on Christmas Day 1941, the German army began its first major retreat of the entire war. The psychological shockwave from this was immense. The army that had seemed unbeatable, that had conquered all of Europe, was now being thrown backwards. The myth was shattered. For good.
So this moment was so much more than just a military loss, it was a lesson, frozen in time for everyone to see. So what were the real long-term consequences of this disaster born from overconfidence? What does this one single moment in history teach us?
The human cost, it's just staggering. In just the first 9 months of this campaign, the German army lost over 830,000 men. And look at this chart. More than a quarter of all those casualties, nearly 230,000 men, were because of the cold. That's an entire army's worth of soldiers, wiped out not by bullets and shells, but by the climate. When you really boil it all down, the lessons are pretty stark, and they're timeless. It doesn't matter how advanced your technology is, you can't just bully the climate. Hubris makes you deaf to the clear warnings of history. And ultimately, it's the boring stuff, logistics, getting the right stuff to the right place, that matters more than any grand ambition. Overconfidence gets you killed.
You know, maybe Guderian himself said it best in his memoirs after the war. He didn't blame his soldiers. In fact, he praised them. He blamed the plan. He blamed the leadership that sent them to fight a war against the terrain and the climate without ever giving them the tools they needed to survive, let alone win.
At the end of the day, the German High Command in 1941 was absolutely certain that their technology, their speed, their sheer willpower made them the exception to the rule. They thought they could break a law of history that had stood for over a century, and they were wrong. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What unbreakable laws of nature